Hebrews 3 through 6. Well, with what was just said in 1 and 2, that Jesus has purged our sins or cleaned us, preparing us to enter sacred space, and that he has not allowed, or he will not allow, the gods of the Old Testament to rule in the next world. Here's where he goes next. Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the, and here are two words that we would not have expected, the apostle and high priest of our faith, or of our confession, Jesus Christ. Again, apostle, we think of Peter, Paul, and John, or Peter, James, and John, but this just means sent one. And priest or high priest, this is the only place, the only book of the New Testament that calls Jesus a priest. Jesus never called himself a priest. No biblical writer like a Paul or a Peter thought of Jesus as a priest. This is reserved only for Hebrews. So we'll get back to the idea of a priest in just a moment. But more importantly, in chapter 3, he says this in 3:2, Jesus was faithful to him. And we have talked about this word quite a bit, and it needs discussion because, again, it's such an integral part of the biblical story. He was faithful to him who appointed him. He was faithful to God, as Moses also was faithful in all his house. The difference will be not that Jesus was more faithful than Moses in chapter 3. It's that Moses is faithful, but he was faithful as a servant. Jesus was faithful, but he was faithful as a son. And then the concept will be, I too can follow in succession and be, and this is interesting, just as faithful as these two. We often think of faith or faithfulness, loyalty. I often get asked this, how behaviorally perfect must I be to qualify to be faithful? It just seems to be such a slippery, subjective word. Well, the Bible uses the word, so it can't be the fault of the word itself. In fact, I'd recommend that it's not a scale issue of 1 to 10. It's a yes or no. And it's as though this question of faithfulness is always pictured as an either or. And in our story, Moses was faithful, Jesus was faithful, and I can be faithful, just as faithful as Jesus. In fact, here's how it goes. It's in 3:6 and 3:14, whose house we are if we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope to the end. 3:14, for we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. I can do it as well as Jesus and Moses did it. So I think just to be, again, careful with this very operative word, this is not a scale word. This is an either or. You're either faithful to Yahweh or you are faithful to some other divine being in the Bible. And so just good to see how that's used. What is the gospel is preached to us as well as to them. This is in 4:2. I think it's simply referring back to the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. It's the great call to monotheism. So the gospel was preached in the Old Testament, faithfulness to Yahweh, just like it is in the New Testament. The difference is Jesus. We are now faithful to two beings, God, Yahweh, and Jesus. But let's get back to Jesus being the priest. This is in chapter 4, beginning in 14. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, he's now in the heavens with Yahweh, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. And again, what is the role of a priest? I think this is often missed. For some reason, we have missed the Old Testament story of priesthood. It was not to save people. A priest would be someone who would meet someone who was already presumed righteous, and he would help that person be an intercessor, whether through sacrifice or some other means, for them to approach, as it were, sacred space. So a priest did not save, and I think we have to get that clear before we ever get into the high priesthood of Jesus, because again, we don't want to misunderstand the story. And a good question that I think that causes the discussion of chapter 5 would be from a Gentile, let's say, who's listening to the book of Hebrews. He would say this: how can Jesus be my priest if, A, I'm a Gentile and Israel's priests served Israelites only? A Moabite, an Ammonite, an Edomite didn't walk up to an Israelite priest and get served. And B, Jesus wasn't from the tribe of Levi, so how could he be a priest at all, even within the Israelite system? Well, here's where that word midrash again comes into play, or weaving, or going back into the Old Testament and finding verses that fit a discussion or an argument. This is in 5:10 of Hebrews. Jesus was called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Who is Melchizedek? Well, he is this mysterious figure in Genesis 14 that when he meets Abraham, we learn in the story, well, here it is in Genesis 14, verse 18, Melchizedek, king of Salem, was the priest of El Elyon, God the highest one. He blessed Abraham and said, "Blessed be Abram of El Elyon, possessor of heaven and earth." And it turns out Abraham worshipped Yahweh, didn't know his name yet, but he called him El Elyon, and so did Melchizedek. They both worshipped the same God. And here is, again, the oddity of the moment. This is a Gentile that Abraham meets on the way into Canaan. And how did he ever come to be? He's a mystery. That's the whole point. And he's mentioned in Psalm 110, verse 4. And so the quick argument of the writer of Hebrews is, if I'm a Gentile, let's pretend I'm a Gentile, and I want to enter the sacred space of Yahweh, to approach the throne of Yahweh, which was the Ark of the Covenant. Do you see how this fits in? I can use, Jesus is now compared to, as it were, a Gentile high priest. And so I can go through him. I can be, in this illustration, I can use a Melchizedek-like figure, that is Jesus, to be my high priest. So I think that's the main simple idea of Jesus being of the line of Melchizedek. Again, it's important to show this is not salvation. If we want to talk about salvation, that would be in 5 verses 8 and 9. Jesus was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered, and having been perfected, Jesus became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Salvation is in lordship terms, not in priestly terms. And again, we don't need to worry about obedience or lordship terms as in behavioral perfection, because as we finish up our reading in 6:9 through 12, listen to how obedience is described in other terms. Beloved, we are confident of better things concerning you, things that accompany salvation, for God is not unjust to forget your work and labor of love, which you have shown toward his name. And we desire that each of you show the same diligence to the full assurance of hope until the end. And here again, maybe even best said, imitating those who through, how would we describe this? Well, in 6:12 it says, through faith and patience inherit the promises.